Our agenda today will cover 5 key areas. These include the compliance requirements for both UBO and media. We'll look at the overarching pronouncements from the quasi-governmental authorities and industry groups, as well as the regulations promulgated in key jurisdictions. We'll then move on to discuss the risk management processes, and specifically the establishment of risk tolerances and risk appetite levels, along with risk mitigants, specifically internal controls. Following that, we'll talk about identifying ultimate beneficial owners and the challenges surrounding complex ownership structures. We'll then talk about analyzing UBO and media and the impact on AML risk. Finally, we will round out our discussion with risk mitigation strategies. When it comes to AML compliance requirements, the notion of knowing who the beneficial owner and ultimate beneficial owners are is fundamental. FATF makes this clear in Recommendation 24, Transparency and Beneficial Ownership of Legal Persons. The recommendation focuses on that countries should have mechanisms to collect and make available beneficial ownership information, and access to that information should be easy in order to facilitate due diligence. Laws such as the EU AML directives set forth requirements for transparency in identifying beneficial owners and set a threshold of greater than 25% holding as an indicator of ownership. Leading industry groups such as Wolfsburg have noted that, among other things, beneficial owners should include those that have ultimate control over funds and/or are the ultimate source of funds for the account, and therefore that source of funds would be subject to due diligence. Following the standards and obligations set forth by organizations such as FATF and Wolfsburg, along with the EU requirements for those members of the EU, major jurisdictions have set forth laws and regulations stipulating that beneficial owners, for example, ultimate beneficial owners or natural persons, must be identified. There are some differences, but generally speaking, the focus is on both ownership and control may or may not rest with a particular corporate officer. In some instances, in an effort to mask the true beneficial owner, companies may be transferred to relatives, for example, spouses or children, but the real control is with someone else, and those wishes are simply being executed by, quote, the owner. This makes it even more difficult for entities such as banks or insurance companies to make a determination on beneficial ownership. Further, when looking closely at different regulatory regimes, there are slight differences. For example, the UK money laundering regulations speak to more than 25% ownership of shares, while the US requirements speak to 25% or more. As noted above, sound regulatory regimes require reporting of and access to beneficial ownership information. The UK has their People with Significant Control register, and the information is reported to Companies House. The US has attempted to implement a beneficial ownership information reporting regime, but that is currently on hold as a result of legal challenges. Regardless of the beneficial ownership information reporting and access, the due diligence requirements within these regulatory regimes remain. Ultimate beneficial owners must be identified, and that responsibility falls to the institution. When it comes to understanding more about those identified beneficial owners, a key component of enhanced due diligence, that is, due diligence applied to higher risk customers, FATF recommends, quote, carrying out additional searches, for example, verifiable adverse media searches, to inform the individual customer risk assessment, close quote. The EU, through the 6th AML directive, calls for, quote, alerting entities to specific persons that present a significant risk of money laundering as predicate offenses or terrorist financing, unquote. The Wolfsburg group, referring to adverse media as negative news, calls for applying negative news as a part of a risk-based approach. These are all good statements, but really leave it open as to what is adverse media. What is the impact on a customer risk assessment, and what is an effective and efficient means for collecting and assessing media to determine if it's adverse? The regulations set forth by the UK and the US speak to gaining a better understanding of the customer's risk, but do very little to articulate how or what is acceptable in terms of processes and evaluation of results. The UK money laundering regulations call for, quote, gaining a better understanding, unquote. The US money laundering regulations suggest an institution, quote, might assess on the basis of risk that a customer presents a higher risk profile. This leaves it to the institution to determine what is acceptable within the confines of their risk tolerance and risk appetite levels. In all of this, the concept of reasonable measures comes into play. In virtually all cases, the regulations are broad, referring to a risk-based approach. This is sometimes difficult to put parameters around because one man's reasonable measures may be another's folly. So how does one define reasonable measures? Well, FATF defines reasonable measures as, quote, appropriate measures which are commensurate with the money laundering or terrorist financing risks, close quotes. I'm not sure that really helps, to be honest. So what must one do? Well, one must start by thinking about the risk management framework, beginning with an understanding of risk tolerance, risk appetite, and the internal controls, which must be designed and implemented to ensure risk appetite thresholds are not exceeded. Let's look at each of these individually and then in the context of an overall framework. Risk tolerance is about what an organization can actually absorb without jeopardizing the ongoing ability to operate. Risk appetite can be defined as the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to take in order to meet their strategic objectives. Risk appetite can change over time. There can be taking on of more of the same type of risk or taking on of new risks, which would involve a renewed look at risk tolerance in order to achieve objectives and outcomes. Internal controls are those activities put in place to ensure that risk appetite levels are not exceeded. It's critically important to monitor risk levels and the performance of internal controls to ensure that when objectives are achieved, there are not unintended or adverse outcomes that accompany that achievement. In the context of UBO and media screening, it's important to consider the risks in the context of underlying offenses that may be revealed through media screening. For example, bribery allegations or terror allegations are different than, let's say, for example, drunken disorderly conduct. And each of those will or should at least should be weighed differently when considering risk tolerances and risk appetite. Further allegations that did not lead to convictions or were many years ago would likely be discounted in part or in whole. So when we think about internal controls and the identification of beneficial owners and potential AML risks, customer data is typically screened against various registries in the case of beneficial owners and against various news sources in the case of media searches. In both cases, the screening tool should allow for consideration of risk tolerance and risk appetite to more quickly and accurately filter through those volumes of data and identify those matches that are likely to represent true risk and therefore should be subject to further review. Of course, identifying ultimate beneficial owners where there is a complex ownership structure can be a challenge. Sifting through mounds of corporate filings to identify ownership would be an impossible task, particularly in large organizations with many, many corporate customers. As you can see in this example, Company A has 5 shareholders. One shareholder is Company B, which holds 50% share. Company B is owned in part by Company D, which owns a 60% interest. Company D is owned in part by Individual 9, who has a 90% ownership interest in Company D. Using those ownership interests, we calculate that Individual 9 has a 27% ownership interest in Company A. Having a technology solution that enables you to conclude quickly on the level of corporate ownership by an ultimate beneficial owner is essential to effectively conduct due diligence. So how does all this come together in the context of AML risk? As the analysis of the UBO and media results is performed individually, the risk can increase by such things as complex business ownership structures, media searches indicating an association with an accusation, an indictment, or a conviction for a financial crime. A combination of both. The UBO is associated with the financial crime versus the company or the related companies. These factors individually and in combination lead to increased AML risk for the customer and your organization. So how best to mitigate these risks? Well, it starts with having both client and compliance data available and passing both sets through a robust data quality engine. Once it is passed through a robust DQ engine, it is passed to technology solutions that effectively and efficiently screen the client data against the compliance data. Matches are produced. Ideally, the technology solutions produce productive matches with a minimal number of false positives. Once the matches are produced, they are passed to a resolution process. Once resolved, those resolved matches are passed to the risk rating engine, which provides an updated risk rating for the customer. It's important to remember here that this process is done at onboarding, but importantly continues throughout the life cycle of the customer. It's critically important that the controls established are tested at the beginning to ensure relevant risks are identified and risks are not hidden due to deficiencies in the matching engine or the underlying data. The testing must continue for so long as the technology is being used. So let's summarize what we've talked about today. First, compliance requirements generally call for identification of beneficial owners and a process to assess reputation. There is generally an expectation that reasonable measures will be undertaken to meet compliance requirements. One must establish risk tolerance and risk appetite levels and identify necessary internal controls. You must apply processes and controls to identify UBOs and adverse reputation risks. You must assess identified matches and resolve as appropriate, and then pass the identified risk issues to the risk engine for an update to the customer risk rating.